All right, class. Now it's time for a brief overview of rhetorical strategies. So, in order to figure out what a rhetorical strategy is, we first have to ask ourselves, what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is defined as the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially the use of figures of speech and other compositional techniques. Essentially, it is the means by which we use language to persuade other people into accepting our point of view. You might also think of it as your communication strategy. Rhetorical strategies are writing techniques that we may use to achieve the goal of rhetoric, which is effective communication. There are a wide array of rhetorical strategies, ranging from description to exemplification to full-blown argumentation. Each strategy functions as a tool in your rhetorical toolbox. A mastery of rhetorical strategies endows an individual with a lot of power. If you can persuade people and are an effective communicator, the world becomes your oyster. All right, so these are the rhetorical strategies that we will be studying. Some of these we will use, others we just want to know about. They are narration, exemplification, classification, sometimes called classification and division, process, definition, compare and contrast, cause and effect, and persuasion. And there's actually one more that I should have included, and that is argumentation. Argumentation is actually considered a separate strategy from persuasion, although they are very similar. Okay, so a narration strategy. Here's a picture of my hen here, my chicken. The narration strategy, narration is the art of storytelling, which is one of the oldest forms of rhetoric. There can be both factual and fictional narratives. Narratives are usually, but not always, in chronological order, and we use narration in the real world when we want to tell a story that encompasses a series of significant events that happen to us. So imagine you're talking to your friend and you want to tell them about your weekend. You're going to start with the beginning, in most cases, and you're going to work up to the major details and end off with a closer. We tell stories in this progression. There's usually a climax to the story. There's usually a beginning and an end. So narration is one strategy that we have to communicate effectively with other people. The exemplification strategy is a little more complicated. Exemplification writing uses multiple examples to help prove a point or concept. This strategy tends to be one of the best ways to prove a point and is an invaluable writing technique. Typically, the most effective communication attempts tend to use specific examples to support opinions. Specific examples, observations, details, etc., are always more successful in writing than generalizations and vague wording. While exemplification can provide structure for an essay, it can also appear in an essay that does not use the exemplification strategy as its main strategy. For instance, you may find multiple examples used in an argumentative essay's body paragraph to help illustrate the writer's argument. When we use the exemplification strategy, we will be using credible sources from Galileo and other databases that we're going to use to back up the claims we're making. So this use of examples, it can be examples from credible sources, or if you were just talking in everyday speech, it could be examples about something to give someone a frame of reference. How many times have you had a discussion with someone and it's clear they're not quite getting it? So you go, for example, and you give them an example, and all of a sudden that little light bulb just clicks. So exemplification can be a very useful strategy and is one that you should keep in your toolbox. Next up is the classification and division strategy. Classification writing involves breaking down a broad category into smaller and more digestible pieces. Classification writing is useful when we are juggling a broad and multifaceted subject which would benefit from dissection. An example of classification writing could start out with the topic of the American South, and then you could break it down by state, or you could break it down by sub-region, explaining the similarities, differences, and nuances between each state that comprises the whole region. Another example of how to use the classification division strategy, if you were going to do a classification division essay on bears, you could have bears as your general topic, and then you break down the topic of bears into several subcategories of bears. So brown bear, black bear, grizzly bear, Kodiak bear, polar bear, These are subcategories of the larger whole, and that's what classification and division is all about. It can help us when we're trying to organize a very broad topic into digestible pieces. The process strategy explains how to do something. It is directional, or how something works, informative. This form of writing can be useful for training coworkers or getting a client to understand new software. You want to be very meticulous and construct the process chronologically so that it can be repeated by your reader. Think of writing a recipe. If you get things mixed up for your reader, they won't think your cooking method is any good. So when we use the process strategy, a lot of students like to do their first essay on a process, and they give me whatever family recipe they have, grandma's enchiladas or something like that. And that's fine. You can definitely do that. But you want to be very meticulous and provide lots of details and make sure that you move in chronological order and that you're very clear. Because if you construct a process essay vaguely and you don't pay attention to detail, the enchiladas are not going to be very good, to say the least. Next comes the definition strategy. The purpose of a definition essay may seem self-explanatory, to write an extended definition of a word or term. But defining terms in writing is often more complicated than just consulting a dictionary. The way that we define terms has an enormous effect on the way that we view the world. So it's important to choose your words carefully. When writing definition essays, avoid terms that are too simple, that lack complexity. Definitions establish the way in which people set parameters for a given discourse, which is why they're so important. I bet you don't really think about how important definitions are, but they really are important. So imagine let's say you were trying to define a hammer. Now you could define a hammer just saying a tool, but there are thousands of different kinds of tools, and that lumps hammer into a very broad category, and we're not even really sure what to do with that. So if you were to be more specific and say a tool that is used to bluntly hammer in nails into a surface, that is a better definition. It gives us a little more information, and we know then exactly what a hammer is for. Compare and contrast strategy. The compare and contrast strategy involves taking two objects in juxtaposition. That's your word of the day, juxtapose. It means to set two things next to each other and discuss both their similarities and their differences. More than simply listing said similarities and differences from one sentence to another, comparison and contrast focuses on the objects in conversation with one another. What sort of relationship do these objects have? Try to note the similarities and differences in an objective and meaningful way. So a lot of people, this is low-hanging fruit in terms of an essay topic, but some people will do like compare and contrast over cats and dogs. What are the similarities between cats and dogs? What are the differences between cats and dogs? And we know that they're both pets and they have a lot of commonality. They both live in people's homes. They both give people comfort. But when we really start to compare and contrast them, we realize that they're not the same thing at all. And that while they may share a lot of commonality, there are important nuanced subtleties that make them very, very different things. This is why the compare and contrast strategy is so useful, because in contrasting and comparing things, we actually get a clearer picture of what those things really are. So this is another strategy that your textbook goes over. The cause and effect strategy. A cause is something that produces an event or condition. An effect is what results from an event or condition. The purpose of the cause and effect essay is to determine how various phenomena relate in terms of origins and results. This form of writing is particularly useful for explaining the potential risks or consequences of certain business decisions. You can do it as like a prediction, or you can do it as it happened in the past. Like I had a student one time write a cause and effect essay on the Chernobyl disaster, which was a terrible nuclear disaster that occurred in Russia in the 80s. And it was definitely something, that was a cause and effect, right? It was a very clear cause for that accident. And so that person wrote about that in the past. But you could also use cause and effect to project a theory about what would happen if, let's say you ran a business. If we expand our business into this area, these effects will happen. And you could write an essay explaining those effects as you predict them, right? So cause and effect can be useful for a lot of different reasons. And then the persuasion strategy. The purpose of persuasion in writing is to convince, motivate, or move readers towards a certain point of view or opinion. The idea of an argument often conjures up images of two people yelling and screaming in anger. In writing, however, an argument is very different. An argument is a reasoned opinion supported and explained by evidence. To argue in writing is to advance knowledge and ideas in a positive way. Written arguments often fail when they employ ranting rather than reasoning. Most of us feel inclined to try to win the arguments we enter. On some level, we all want to be right, and we want others to see the error of their ways. But the more productive approach is to persuade your audience to consider your opinion as a valid one, not simply the right one. And it's oftentimes that there isn't a single right opinion. The world is a very complicated place. There are a lot of different variables. So really, all you want to do is not necessarily win your reader's mind over completely, but convince them that your position is viable. That is what persuasion is all about. Now, the textbook doesn't really make much of a definition between persuasion and argumentation, but we have a supplemental lecture specifically for argumentation, which is the final strategy. Argumentation allows a writer to present a logical and debatable viewpoint, position, or belief. Argumentation writing is part of a larger debate or conversation, and the writer uses this strategy to take a stand. Argumentation is effective for persuasion because writers need to incorporate evidence in the form of research, experience, statistics, etc. If you want to change your readers' opinions, defend your viewpoint. Convince your readers that your ideas are valid, or even question someone else's stance on an issue. The argumentative strategy is essential. While argumentation can provide structure for an essay, it can also appear in an essay that does not use argumentation strategy as its main strategy. In an argumentative essay, you must assert argumentative claims and form topic sentences and fortify these claims with evidence and analysis. So argumentation is very similar to persuasion. The only distinction is argumentation is a little more maybe aggressive, but not necessarily in a bad way. But you're more on the attack. You wanna diffuse your opponent's viewpoint, attack their viewpoint, and fortify yours. Argumentation is good, but you can sort of get caught in being right, which you want to be careful. You just want to make sure that you are as objective as possible. And so it's another useful strategy that we have. These strategies all appear in your textbook. The textbook is listed at the top of the lessons folder. It's also in the supplemental folders, the chapters themselves. So each of the chapters goes over one of the strategies and explains it in detail and explains how to construct a full essay using that specific strategy. So this is just an overview presentation. You have a general idea of what these strategies are, and over the course, the coming weeks of the semester, I will teach you how to implement these strategies in your writing, and how to write an essay based on one or more of these strategies to achieve effective communication. All right, in the interest of keeping it short and sweet, I will just end it there. Please keep an eye out for the lessons forthcoming on on rhetorical strategies and their use. And please let me know if you have any questions. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, whatever time of day it is for you.